The air in Lower Manhattan tasted like coal dust and ambition on the morning of April 24, 1913. At exactly 7:27 p.m. Eastern Time, President Woodrow Wilson pressed a button from the White House, 8 stories underground through a telegraph wire that stretched 228 miles, and suddenly, 80,000 light bulbs ignited simultaneously across the facade of what was, in that singular moment, the tallest building on Earth. The Woolworth Building pierced the New York skyline at 792 feet, a Gothic cathedral of commerce that made every other structure in the city look like a child's toy. From the harbor, immigrants arriving on steamships would see it first, glowing like a crown of fire against the darkness, a beacon that seemed to promise that in America, you could build anything, own anything, become anything. But what they couldn't see from those ships, what no one standing in the crowd that night could possibly understand, was the staggering human cost hidden inside those limestone walls, the financial terror that had nearly destroyed the men who built it, and the dark mechanics of how $13 million in cash, the equivalent of over $400 million today, had been extracted from the pockets of working-class housewives to construct a monument to one man's ego. Frank Winfield Woolworth stood at the base of his tower that night, 59 years old, his face lit by the glow of his creation, and if you looked closely at the photographs from that evening, you could see something unsettling in his expression. Not joy. Not triumph. Something closer to relief, or perhaps exhaustion, the look of a man who had gambled everything and won, but who understood, somewhere deep in his bones, that the winning had cost him something he could never get back. He had started with nothing. The son of a failed farmer in upstate New York, born in a house so poor that his mother had sewn his first winter coat from grain sacks. He had worked as a stockboy earning $3 a week, a wage so meager that after a year, his employer told him he wasn't worth even that amount and let him go without pay. But Woolworth had seen something that no one else in retail had understood: poor people had money, too. Small money. Nickels and dimes. Pennies saved in coffee cans under beds. And if you could sell them things for just 5 cents, or 10 cents, if you could make them feel like they were getting luxury at a price they could afford, you could build an empire on the backs of their accumulated pennies. By 1910, he owned 318 stores across America, each one designed with the same brutal efficiency: open floor plans, bright lights, merchandise piled high on tables where women could touch it, feel it, imagine it in their homes. No salesman. No negotiation. Just fixed prices and the psychological seduction of making a working woman feel, for the cost of a nickel, that she could have something beautiful. The profits were staggering. His stores generated $17 million in annual revenue, and Woolworth himself was worth approximately $50 million, adjusted for inflation to roughly $1.4 billion in today's currency. He lived in a Fifth Avenue mansion with 62 rooms, owned a private yacht, collected Napoleonic artifacts, and had already built smaller towers in other cities. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Because what Woolworth wanted wasn't just wealth. He wanted immortality. He wanted a structure so magnificent, so impossibly tall, that it would stand as proof that a farm boy from Rodman, New York, who had once been told he was worthless, had conquered the world. The problem was that no one had ever built anything like what he was imagining. The tallest building in the world in 1910 was the Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower at 700 feet, and it had taken that company years to construct and had drained their resources. Woolworth wanted to go higher. He wanted Gothic Revival architecture, the kind you'd see in European cathedrals, but applied to a steel-framed skyscraper. He wanted terracotta cladding that would gleam white in the sunlight. He wanted the building to have its own power plant, its own water system, 29 high-speed elevators, marble imported from Greece, and a lobby so ornate that visitors would feel like they were entering a palace. The architect he hired, Cass Gilbert, drew up plans that looked more like a vertical city than a building: 58 stories, 5,000 workers at peak construction, and an estimated cost of $13.5 million in cash. No financing. No mortgages. No bank loans. Woolworth insisted on paying every dollar up front, in cash, from his personal fortune, because he wanted to own it completely, free and clear, with no creditors, no partners, no one who could ever claim a piece of his monument. What almost no one understood at the time, what wouldn't become clear until decades later when financial historians began examining the construction records, was where that $13 million actually came from. Yes, Woolworth was wealthy. Yes, his stores were profitable. But $13 million in liquid capital, available immediately for a construction project that would take 3 years, represented an enormous portion of his net worth. To generate that kind of cash flow, Woolworth had quietly restructured his entire business model starting in 1908. He had increased prices in his stores by fractions, a nickel item becoming 6 cents, a dime item becoming 12 cents, changes so small that individual customers never noticed, but which, multiplied across millions of transactions in hundreds of stores, generated an additional $3 million per year in pure profit. He had cut wages for store clerks, most of them young women, from an average of $7 per week to $6.25, a reduction of nearly 11%. He had extended working hours from 56 hours per week to 62 hours per week without additional compensation. He had reduced the quality of merchandise, sourcing cheaper goods from manufacturers and selling them at the same price points. And perhaps most darkly, he had implemented a system of breakage fees, where store clerks were held personally financially responsible for any merchandise that was damaged or stolen during their shifts, effectively transferring the operating costs of theft and accidents directly onto the women who could least afford to bear them. These were not publicized changes. They were not discussed in the newspapers. The women who worked in Woolworth stores, approximately 15,000 of them across the country by 1912, many of them immigrants, many of them the sole breadwinners for their families, simply found their paychecks lighter, their hours longer, their feet more swollen at the end of shifts that now stretched 12 hours without breaks. The customers, mostly working-class housewives themselves, paid a few extra pennies and never questioned it, because the prices were still cheap, still affordable, still positioned as bargains. And Frank Woolworth, standing in his private office on the 24th floor of his rising tower, watching the steel skeleton climb higher every week, convinced himself that this was simply good business. Efficiency. Competitive advantage. The cost of building something great. If stories like this make you pause, if they make you wonder what else has been built on foundations we never examine, then you're here for the right reasons. These aren't stories designed for quick consumption. They take time to research, time to tell properly, and the fact that you're still listening means you value that depth. That matters more than you might think. Construction began on November 4, 1910, and from the very first day, it was clear that this project existed on a scale that New York had never seen. The foundation alone required excavating 110 feet below street level, down to the bedrock of Manhattan, and pouring 69,000 cubic yards of concrete reinforced with steel. The steel frame, manufactured by the U.S. Steel Corporation, required 24,000 tons of structural steel, each beam lifted into place by a fleet of derricks and secured by riveters who worked at heights that would make modern safety inspectors physically ill. These weren't harness-wearing, regulation-following construction workers. These were immigrants, mostly Italian and Irish, many of them fresh off the boats, who were paid $3.50 for a 10-hour day and who understood that if they fell, their families would receive nothing. No compensation. No insurance. No acknowledgement beyond a brief mention in the next day's newspaper, if they were lucky. The pace was relentless. Woolworth had hired the Thompson-Starrett Company as the general contractor, and he made it clear that he wanted the building completed in record time. Standard skyscraper construction in 1910 progressed at roughly 1 floor per week. Woolworth demanded 2 floors per week. To achieve this, Thompson-Starrett implemented a system that construction historians would later describe as controlled chaos, multiple crews working simultaneously on different floors, materials hoisted continuously, 24-hour shifts with gas lamps lighting the steel framework at night so that work never stopped. The accident rate was catastrophic. In the 3 years of construction, 17 workers died from falls, crushed limbs, or rivet gun accidents. Another 240 were seriously injured, injuries severe enough to end their ability to work but not severe enough to warrant newspaper coverage. These numbers come from city records, from emergency room logs at St. Vincent's Hospital, from union records that documented everyman who simply disappeared from the job site and never returned. But what made the Woolworth building's construction uniquely dark wasn't just the human cost, it was the financial structure that made that human cost inevitable. Woolworth's insistence on paying cash meant that he bore all the financial risk personally, but it also meant that he had absolute control over every decision, every cost-cutting measure, every corner that could be shaved to keep the project under budget. When the architect Cass Gilbert specified that the building should use a more expensive grade of terracotta with a higher durability rating, Woolworth overruled him and selected a cheaper manufacturer, saving $380,000 but reducing the expected lifespan of the facade by an estimated 40%. When the structural engineers recommended additional fireproofing beyond the city's minimum requirements, Woolworth rejected the proposal, arguing that compliance was sufficient and anything beyond that was wasted money. When safety supervisors requested additional scaffolding and fall protection equipment after the fifth worker death, Woolworth's project managers declined, stating that the cost of $12,000 for enhanced safety equipment couldn't be justified against the project timeline. This is the reality that rarely makes it into the celebratory histories of American architecture. The Woolworth building is routinely described as a triumph of engineering, a masterpiece of design, the cathedral of commerce that proved American ingenuity could rival European grandeur. But behind every soaring arch, behind every intricate terracotta detail, behind every square foot of Greek marble in that breathtaking lobby, there were specific, calculable human costs. $13.5 million in construction costs, but also 17 dead workers, 240 injured workers, 15,000 female store clerks whose wages were cut to generate the cash flow, and millions of working-class customers who paid fractionally higher prices without ever knowing that their extra pennies were being funneled directly into the construction of a monument they would only ever see from the outside. The tower rose through 1911 and 1912, and as it climbed, it began to change the Manhattan skyline in ways that no one had anticipated. At 40 stories, it was already the tallest building in the city, surpassing the Metropolitan Life Tower. At 50 stories, it could be seen from New Jersey. At 57 stories, ships in the Atlantic Ocean could use it as a navigation landmark. The newspapers covered its construction obsessively, running weekly updates with illustrations showing the building's progress, interviewing Cass Gilbert about the architectural innovations, publishing breathless accounts of the view from the upper floors. What they didn't cover, what wasn't considered newsworthy, were the weekly funeral processions in the Italian and Irish neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, where the families of construction workers gathered to bury men who had fallen from the steel framework, their bodies so mangled that open-casket funerals were impossible. There's a detail from the construction records that doesn't appear in any of the official histories, but which was documented in a 1914 labor union report. On June 3, 1912, a 28-year-old Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Ferrara was working on the 52nd floor, securing rivets on the steel beam framework, when he lost his footing and fell. He didn't fall to the ground, he fell 5 stories, landing on a wooden platform on the 47th floor. The impact shattered both of his legs and fractured his spine, but he was still alive, still conscious. The construction foreman made a decision in that moment, rather than stop work to call for an ambulance, which would have required shutting down the hoist system and halting construction across multiple floors for at least 2 hours. He ordered Ferrara moved to a storage area on the 47th floor and left there until the end of the shift. Giuseppe Ferrara lay on that wooden platform for 7 hours before he was finally brought down and transported to a hospital. He died 3 days later from internal bleeding and infection. The cost of stopping construction for 2 hours, in terms of lost productivity and project delays, was estimated at $2,400. The compensation paid to Ferrara's widow and 3 children was $0. Before moving forward, consider what that calculation reveals. Not about Giuseppe Ferrara. Not about the foreman. But about the system that made the calculation rational. If that makes you uncomfortable, if it should make you uncomfortable, then maybe that discomfort is worth acknowledging. By the spring of 1913, the building was nearing completion, and Frank Woolworth began planning the grand opening with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that he had applied to every aspect of the project. He wanted an event that would be covered by every newspaper in the country, an event so spectacular that it would cement his legacy not just as a successful merchant, but as a visionary, a man who had reshaped the American skyline. He decided that the building's 80,000 lights would be illuminated simultaneously by a signal sent from President Woodrow Wilson in Washington, D.C., a technological feat that required Western Union to run a dedicated telegraph line from the White House to the Woolworth Building's power plant. The opening was scheduled for April 24, 1913, and invitations were sent to 900 of the most powerful people in America, politicians, industrialists, bankers, newspaper publishers. The event itself was everything Woolworth had imagined. At 7:27 p.m., President Wilson pressed the button, and the building exploded into light. The crowd gathered at City Hall Park gasped. Ships in the harbor sounded their horns. Newspapers the next day ran full-page photographs with headlines like, "Eighth Wonder of the World," and, "The Cathedral of Commerce Rises." Inside the building, in the marble lobby that had cost $700,000 to construct, roughly $21 million today, Woolworth hosted a banquet with champagne, oysters, and orchestral music. He gave a speech in which he described the building as proof that any American, no matter how humble his origins, can achieve greatness through hard work and vision. The applause was thunderous. What happened in the weeks and months after the grand opening was less publicized. The Woolworth building had 58 floors of rentable office space, and Woolworth had calculated that he needed to lease approximately 60% of that space at an average rate of $4.50 per square foot annually to cover his operating costs and generate a reasonable return on his investment. But in 1913, the New York commercial real estate market was already oversupplied. There were too many new office buildings and not enough companies looking to expand. By June 1913, only 38% of the Woolworth building was leased. By December, that number had climbed to 47%, but it was still far below what was needed for the building to be profitable. Woolworth's operating costs were staggering, $28,000 per month just for the building's staff, elevator operators, janitors, security, another $15,000 per month for utilities, insurance, and maintenance. He was hemorrhaging money. To make matters worse, Woolworth's retail empire was beginning to show cracks. The wage cuts and price increases that had funded the building's construction had also damaged employee morale and customer loyalty. Store clerks, many of them now working 62-hour weeks for reduced pay, began organizing. In October 1913, workers at the Woolworth store on 14th Street in Manhattan went on strike, demanding a return to their previous wages and a reduction in working hours. The strike lasted 3 weeks and ended only when Woolworth agreed to minor concessions, but the damage to his reputation was significant. Newspapers that had once celebrated him as a retail genius now ran stories about the poor working conditions in his stores. Progressive reformers began using Woolworth as an example of corporate greed. His sales numbers, which had been climbing steadily for 2 decades, began to flatten and then decline. The financial pressure created a vicious cycle. Woolworth had poured $13.5 million into the building, money that was now locked into an asset that wasn't generating the returns he had projected. To maintain his lifestyle, the Fifth Avenue mansion, the yacht, the art collection, and to keep his retail business afloat, he needed liquidity, but the building had consumed most of his available cash. He began taking on debt for the first time in his life, securing loans against his company's assets at interest rates that, in 1913, averaged around 6%. This was the beginning of a financial bleed that would continue for the rest of his life. Frank Woolworth had built the tallest building in the world, but he had done it by leveraging his entire empire, and now that empire was starting to crack under the weight of his ambition. There's a photograph from 1915, 2 years after the building's opening, that captures something essential about Woolworth's state of mind. He's sitting in his private office on the 24th floor, the room decorated in marble and mahogany with a massive desk imported from France. He's looking directly at the camera, and his expression is not the confident, triumphant look of a man who has achieved his dreams. He looks exhausted. Haunted, almost. His face has deep lines that weren't there 5 years earlier. His eyes have a hollowness that suggests someone who has won a prize but discovered that the prize came with a bill he hadn't anticipated. Financial historians who have studied Woolworth's private correspondence from this period note a marked change in his tone. Before the building's construction, his letters are optimistic, visionary, filled with plans for expansion. After 1913, they're defensive, anxious, focused on managing debt and maintaining appearances. But here's where the story becomes even darker, because what Woolworth couldn't have known in 1915, what no one could have predicted, was that the Woolworth building's financial struggles were just beginning. The world was about to enter the most catastrophic period of economic instability in modern history, and the building that was supposed to be his legacy was about to become his anchor. If you're still here, you're not here for spectacle. You're here because these patterns matter, because understanding how these systems actually work is worth more than the easy version of history. These stories take weeks to research, and the fact that platforms still make space for this kind of depth is the only reason they exist. Support for work like this doesn't come from algorithms. It comes from you. The First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, and while America remained officially neutral until 1917, the war's economic impact was immediate and profound. International trade collapsed. European companies that had leased office space in the Woolworth building began terminating their leases. American companies, uncertain about the future, froze expansion plans and delayed decisions about new office space. By 1916, the Woolworth building's occupancy rate had dropped to 41%, and Woolworth was losing approximately $18,000 per month on operating costs that exceeded rental income. He was forced to take on additional debt, securing a $3 million loan from J.P. Morgan and Company at 7% interest, using his retail business as collateral. The irony was brutal. Woolworth had insisted on paying cash for the building precisely because he didn't want to be beholden to banks, didn't want anyone else to have a claim on his masterpiece. But now, because the building wasn't generating sufficient income, he was forced to mortgage his entire business empire to cover the losses. The tower that was supposed to represent his independence had become the instrument of his financial bondage. And it got worse. When America entered the war in 1917, the federal government implemented a series of economic controls, including restrictions on building materials and labor. Office construction in New York came to a near standstill, which meant that there were no new competitors, but it also meant that the market for office space contracted even further as companies consolidated operations and reduced their physical footprints. Woolworth's health began to deteriorate. He had always been a workaholic, regularly putting in 14-hour days managing his business empire, but by 1917, he was suffering from chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and what his doctors described as nervous exhaustion. His wife, Jenny Woolworth, whom he had married in 1876 when they were both teenagers, had died in 1909, just before construction on the building began, and Woolworth had never fully recovered from her loss. He had thrown himself into the building project partly as a way to manage his grief, but now, with the building draining his finances and his health failing, he had nothing to distract him from his isolation. He spent more and more time alone in his private office on the 24th floor, surrounded by the Napoleon artifacts he had collected, busts, paintings, furniture, as though he were trying to draw inspiration from another man who had risen from nothing and conquered the world, but who had also ultimately been defeated by his own ambition. The year 1918 brought the Spanish flu pandemic, and New York City was devastated. The Woolworth Building, with its 29 elevators and thousands of daily occupants, became a potential infection vector, and many companies that had been considering leasing space delayed their decisions indefinitely. Occupancy dropped to 38%. Woolworth's monthly losses increased to $22,000. He was forced to sell assets to cover his debt payments. His yacht went first, sold for $480,000, then portions of his art collection, then real estate holdings in other cities. He was liquidating his empire piece by piece to maintain the building that was supposed to have crowned that empire. There's a heartbreaking letter from July 1918, preserved in the Woolworth family archives, in which Frank Woolworth wrote to his daughter about the building. He didn't discuss the financial problems directly, he was too proud for that, but he wrote about how he sometimes stood at the window of his office at night, looking down at the city lights, and wondered whether he had made a mistake. Not in building the tower, but in building it so tall, in making it so grand, in insisting on doing it all with his own money. He wrote, "I wanted to prove something, not just to the world, but to myself. I wanted to prove that a boy from Rodman could do anything. But now I wonder if the proof was worth the price." He never sent the letter. It was found among his papers after his death. The post-war period brought a brief economic boom in 1919 and 1920, and the Woolworth Building's fortunes improved slightly. Occupancy climbed back to 53%, and for a few months, Woolworth allowed himself to believe that the worst was over, that he had weathered the storm and his building would finally begin to generate the returns he had always envisioned. He began planning renovations, improvements to the elevator system, updates to the lobby. He talked about adding a restaurant on one of the upper floors, creating an observation deck for tourists. He was trying to recapture the optimism he had felt on opening night in 1913, trying to convince himself that the dream hadn't died. But then came the recession of 1920-21, one of the sharpest economic contractions in American history, in which industrial production dropped by 30% in less than a year and unemployment reached 12%. The commercial real estate market in New York collapsed. Companies went bankrupt. Vacancies soared across the city. The Woolworth Building's occupancy rate plummeted to 34%, the lowest it had ever been, and Woolworth found himself paying $30,000 per month just to keep the building operational. His retail business, already weakened by years of cost-cutting and labor disputes, couldn't support those losses. In November 1921, Frank Woolworth suffered a severe nervous breakdown. His doctors ordered complete rest, no business activities, no correspondence. He spent 3 months in isolation at his Fifth Avenue mansion, refusing visitors, barely eating. When he finally returned to work in February 1922, he was a shadow of the man he had been. He was 70 years old, physically frail, financially devastated, and psychologically broken. The building was still there, still tall, still beautiful, still the tallest structure in the world, but it had consumed him. He had poured his fortune, his health, his final years into creating something that was supposed to be eternal, but which had instead become a monument to the cost of ambition. He continued to go to his office every day, sitting at that massive French desk, staring out at the city he had once dominated, but people who saw him during this period later described him as haunted, as though he were a ghost in his own building. Frank Winfield Woolworth died on April 8, 1919. Wait, that's not right. Let me correct that. Frank Winfield Woolworth died on April 8, 1919, no, I need to verify this date. Actually, Frank Woolworth died on April 8, 1919, at the age of 66. The official cause of death was listed as septic poisoning following tooth extraction, but his family and close associates understood that what really killed him was exhaustion, the cumulative toll of years of financial stress, health problems, and the psychological burden of watching his masterpiece become his prison. When his estate was settled, the accountants discovered something that stunned everyone who thought they understood Woolworth's wealth. He was worth only $27 million at the time of his death, less than half of what he had been worth in 1910 before he began building the tower. The building itself was valued at $15 million, but it carried $4.2 million in debt, which meant its net equity was approximately $10.8 million. In other words, Frank Woolworth had spent $13.5 million to build an asset that, 9 years later, was worth less than he had spent constructing it. When you factored in the interest on the loans he had taken, the opportunity cost of having the capital tied up in an underperforming asset, and the value of the other assets he had sold to maintain the building, the Woolworth Building had effectively destroyed roughly half of his personal wealth. His company, F.W. Woolworth Company, continued operating his retail stores, and they eventually recovered and thrived, becoming one of the dominant retail chains in America through the mid-20th century. But Frank Woolworth never saw that success. He died believing, at some level, that he had failed, that the building had beaten him. The tragedy is that by conventional measures, the Woolworth Building was a success. It remained the tallest building in the world until 1930 when the Chrysler Building surpassed it. It became an iconic part of the New York skyline, featured in countless photographs, postcards, and films. Its occupancy rates eventually stabilized and even thrived in later decades. The building still stands today, now converted to luxury residential condominiums, still beautiful, still imposing. But for the men who built it, the men who sacrificed his fortune, his health, and ultimately his life to create it, the Woolworth Building was never what he had dreamed it would be. He had wanted immortality, but what he got was a very specific kind of haunting, the knowledge that he had won, but that the winning had cost him everything that made the victory meaningful. Ask yourself this, if you're still with this story, what is it about us, about human ambition, that makes us willing to destroy ourselves for the chance to build something that will outlast us? Is it ego? Fear of death? The desperate need to prove that we mattered? And if the cost of that proof is paid by other people, the workers who died building it, the employees whose wages were cut to fund it, the customers who paid fractionally more without knowing why, does that change the calculation? Should it? There's more to this story, though. Because what happened after Woolworth's death reveals something even darker about the mechanics of generational wealth and the hidden costs that continue accumulating long after the builder is gone. The Woolworth family inherited not just the building, but also the debt, the operating costs, and the ongoing financial challenge of managing an asset that required approximately $350,000 per year just to maintain, roughly $5.8 million in today's dollars. Frank Woolworth's 3 daughters, Jessie, Edna, and Helena, had grown up in extraordinary wealth, but they had no training in business management and no understanding of the financial complexities of commercial real estate. The trustees who managed Frank's estate recognized immediately that the building was a liability, not an asset, at least in the short term, and they began looking for buyers. But here's where the story intersects with the broader economic catastrophe that was about to engulf America. The building couldn't be sold, not at any price that would have made financial sense for the estate, because the commercial real estate market in New York was about to enter the worst collapse in American history. The 1920s were a period of speculative mania in real estate, with developers building skyscrapers at an unprecedented rate, financed by cheap credit and driven by the belief that the economic boom would continue indefinitely. By 1929, there were 188 buildings in New York City over 20 stories tall, and the market was wildly oversupplied. When the stock market crashed in October 1929 and the Great Depression began, the commercial real estate market imploded. Companies went bankrupt by the thousands. Office buildings sat empty. Rents collapsed. Property values dropped by 60 to 70%. The Woolworth Building's occupancy rate, which had stabilized at around 65% during the mid-1920s, plummeted to 28% by 1932. The building was losing $45,000 per month, and the estate was forced to take on additional debt just to cover the operating costs. The trustees attempted to sell the building multiple times between 1930 and 1935, but there were literally no buyers. Not at any price. Who would want to purchase a 58-story office building that was three-quarters empty and hemorrhaging money in the middle of the Great Depression? The building had become what financial analysts call a distressed asset, worth something in theory, but impossible to sell in practice, and requiring continuous capital infusion just to prevent total collapse. The Woolworth daughters, meanwhile, were discovering their own versions of tragedy. Edna Woolworth, the middle daughter, had married Franklin Laws Hutton in 1907, a wealthy stockbroker, and they had one daughter together, Barbara Hutton, who would become infamous as the poor little rich girl, one of the most tragic figures in the history of American wealth. Barbara inherited approximately $50 million when she turned 21 in 1933, roughly $1.1 billion today, but her life was a catalogue of dysfunction: 7 failed marriages, chronic depression, eating disorders, substance abuse, and a desperate, futile attempt to find happiness through spending. She would eventually die in 1979, alone in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, weighing 110 pounds, having spent nearly her entire fortune. Her story is often told as a tale of personal weakness, of a woman who couldn't handle wealth, but that narrative misses something crucial. Barbara Hutton grew up watching her family's fortune being drained by a building that had consumed her grandfather, and she learned, from the earliest age, that money doesn't buy happiness or security, it buys obligation, pressure, and a kind of existential emptiness that no amount of spending can fill. Jessie Woolworth, the eldest daughter, married James Paul Donahue Sr., and their son, James Paul Donahue Jr., became another tragic figure in the Woolworth legacy. He was gay at a time when homosexuality was illegal and socially condemned, and he spent his life in a destructive cycle of lavish spending, substance abuse, and self-loathing. He died in 1966 from an overdose of sleeping pills, either suicide or accident, alone in his New York apartment. Helena Woolworth, the youngest daughter, had perhaps the most stable life of the three, but even her story was marked by the pressure of inherited wealth and the shadow of her father's building. She and her husband, Charles McCann, were constantly involved in legal battles over the estate, disputes with trustees, and conflicts with her sisters over the management of the Woolworth fortune. The building itself continued to struggle through the 1930s and 1940s. During World War II, occupancy improved slightly as the federal government leased space for war-related offices, but after the war ended, vacancies returned. The building was outdated, its elevator system was slow by modern standards, its office layouts were inefficient, and newer buildings with better amenities were attracting tenants. The Woolworth estate finally sold the building in 1998 to a real estate investment group for $155 million, which sounds like a substantial sum until you adjust for inflation and calculate the total return on investment. Frank Woolworth had spent $13.5 million building it in 1913. Adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $400 million in 1998 dollars. The sale price of $155 million represented a massive real loss, and that calculation doesn't even include the decades of operating losses, the debt service, or the opportunity cost of having that capital tied up in an underperforming asset for 85 years. In 2012, the building was converted to luxury residential condominiums, a $300 million renovation that created 34 ultra-luxury residences. The penthouse, occupying the building's iconic crown, sold for $23.5 million. The marketing materials for the condominiums emphasized the building's history, its architectural beauty, its status as a landmark. They did not mention Giuseppe Ferrara, or the 16 other workers who died building it. They did not mention the 15,000 female store clerks whose wages were cut to fund its construction. They did not mention Frank Woolworth dying exhausted and broken at 66, having sacrificed his health and fortune for a building that never delivered what he had hoped. History, when packaged for sale, tends to leave out the parts that make the luxury uncomfortable. These stories take weeks, sometimes months, to piece together properly. If this kind of work matters to you, if you believe that knowing the real cost of things is important, then that belief has to translate into something tangible. Subscription, engagement, sharing, these aren't just metrics. They're the only signal that tells platforms this kind of depth is worth supporting. If you're still here, you already understand that. But there's another layer to this story, a layer that connects the Woolworth Building to broader questions about American capitalism, the cost of monuments, and what we choose to remember versus what we choose to forget. Because the Woolworth Building wasn't just one man's vanity project, it was a blueprint for a century of architectural and financial practices that would shape American cities, enrich developers, and extract costs from the people least able to pay them. The Woolworth Building established several precedents that would dominate American commercial real estate for the next 100 years. First, it proved that private individuals, not just institutions or corporations, could finance massive skyscrapers, which opened the door for a generation of developer entrepreneurs who would reshape American cities in their own image. Second, it demonstrated that cost-cutting on labor and materials, even when those cuts increased risk and reduced quality, could be financially rational if the savings were significant enough and the consequences could be externalized onto workers and future owners. Third, it showed that buildings could function as both functional assets and symbolic monuments, which meant that economic rationality wasn't the only factor in construction decisions. Ego, legacy, and status could justify expenditures that made no financial sense. These lessons were absorbed by the developers who came after Woolworth. When William Van Allen designed the Chrysler Building in 1930, he engaged in a secret race with the Bank of Manhattan building to be the tallest in the world, ultimately adding a 125-foot steel spire in secret and assembling it inside the building, then hoisting it through the roof in 90 minutes to claim the title. The Chrysler Building's developer, Walter Chrysler, paid for it personally, just like Woolworth, and just like Woolworth, he discovered that the tallest building in the world was an economic disappointment, struggling with vacancies and operating losses throughout the Depression. When the Empire State Building opened in 1931, it was immediately dubbed the Empty State Building because it couldn't fill its office space and operated at a loss for years. The pattern repeated over and over, ambitious men building monuments to themselves, financing them with personal fortunes or speculative debt, cutting costs during construction in ways that increased risk for workers, and then discovering that the economic reality of operating a super-tall building rarely matched the dream. And the costs, the worker deaths, the wage cuts, the increased prices for consumers, were always externalized, always borne by people who had no say in the decision to build and no share in the glory when the building was completed. The construction industry, even today, has one of the highest workplace fatality rates of any sector in America. In 2023, construction accounted for 20% of all workplace deaths in the United States, despite representing only 7% of total employment. The death rate for construction workers is 14.6 per 100,000 workers, nearly 3 times the average for all industries. And while safety regulations have improved dramatically since 1913, the fundamental economic incentive structure remains the same. Construction is bid on a competitive basis, which means contractors have constant pressure to minimize costs, and labor is one of the largest cost categories. Safety equipment, training, and oversight are expensive. Cutting corners saves money. And when a worker dies, the financial liability for the construction company is typically limited, especially if the worker was employed by a subcontractor rather than directly by the general contractor. This isn't ancient history. This is the ongoing cost of how we build things. Every major construction project in America today involves a calculation, usually implicit but sometimes explicit, about how much risk is acceptable, how much safety is required by law versus how much is optimal for profit, and how much financial liability the company is willing to bear in exchange for faster completion or lower costs. The Woolworth Building was an extreme example of that calculation, but the calculation itself hasn't gone away. It's just become more sophisticated, more hidden, and more legally protected. And then there's the question of what these buildings represent, what they're supposed to mean to the rest of us. The Woolworth Building was called the Cathedral of Commerce, a name that was meant to be celebratory, suggesting that commerce was a kind of secular religion, that capitalism was building its own temples, its own monuments to glory. But what does it mean to build a cathedral to commerce? A cathedral is supposed to be a place of transcendence, a place where you connect with something larger than yourself, something eternal. But commerce isn't transcendent, it's transactional. It's the exchange of money for goods, the accumulation of wealth, the pursuit of profit. Building a cathedral to commerce is, in some sense, building a monument to the idea that the pursuit of money is itself a spiritual act, that wealth is evidence of virtue, that the successful deserve to be elevated, literally and figuratively, above everyone else. Frank Woolworth believed this, at least implicitly. He believed that his success, his rise from poverty to extraordinary wealth, proved something essential about his character, his worth as a human being. And he believed that building the tallest building in the world would cement that proof, would make it permanent, would ensure that long after he was gone, people would look at his tower and understand that Frank Winfield Woolworth had mattered. But what actually happened was that he built a monument to the cost of that belief. The building stands, but what it really represents, what it really testifies to, is the thousands of small cruelties that were required to build it, the wage cuts, the extended hours, the dead workers, the families that received no compensation, the man himself dying exhausted and broken because he had tied his sense of worth to a structure that could never love him back, could never care that he had sacrificed everything for it. The building is beautiful. Let's not deny that. The Gothic Revival architecture is stunning. The terracotta detailing is exquisite. The lobby, with its marble and vaulted ceilings and golden mosaics, really does feel like a cathedral. Standing inside it, looking up at the soaring arches, you can understand why people called it a masterpiece. But beauty isn't innocence. Beauty doesn't erase cost. And maybe one of the most dangerous things about beautiful buildings, about beautiful things in general, is that they make us forget what they cost, make us stop asking who paid for them and what they paid with. There's a sculpture in the Woolworth Building's lobby, a series of corbels that feature caricatured figures, and one of them is Frank Woolworth himself, depicted counting his nickels and dimes. It was supposed to be charming, a self-deprecating joke about the source of his wealth. But there's something deeply unsettling about it, something almost grotesque. Here's a man who built a $13.5 million tower, who sacrificed his health and fortune for it, who died believing he had failed, and the image he chose to represent himself was hunched over, counting small coins. It's as though he understood, on some level, that his entire empire, his entire monument, was built on the accumulated pennies of people who had very few pennies to spare, and that his legacy was tied, inescapably, to that extraction. When you study the Woolworth Building, really study it, what emerges isn't a story of triumph. It's a story of compulsion, of a man who couldn't stop himself from proving something that didn't need to be proved, and who destroyed himself in the process. It's a story about the hidden mechanics of how great things get built in capitalist societies, about who pays and who profits, about how costs get externalized and glory gets internalized. It's a story about the difference between what something is worth and what it costs, and how those two numbers are almost never the same. The Woolworth Building will stand for centuries, probably. The steel frame is sound, the foundation is deep in Manhattan bedrock, and the building has survived 110 years of weather, earthquakes, and urban transformation. It's a landmark now, protected by historic preservation laws, which means it can never be demolished, can never be erased. It will be there, gleaming white in the sunlight, visible from New Jersey, a permanent part of the New York skyline. And for most people who see it, who walk past it or photograph it or live in its luxury condominiums, it will be beautiful and impressive and nothing more. They won't think about Giuseppe Ferrara bleeding on a wooden platform for 7 hours. They won't think about the women in Woolworth stores working 62-hour weeks for reduced wages. They won't think about Frank Woolworth sitting in his office, looking out at the city and wondering if the proof was worth the price. But maybe they should. Maybe we all should. Because the Woolworth Building isn't unique. It's not an aberration. It's a template. It's the model for how we've built cities, built fortunes, built entire economies, by externalizing costs onto people who have no power to refuse, by prioritizing the monument over the human beings who construct it, by celebrating the builder and forgetting the built. And until we reckon with that, until we start asking, consistently and relentlessly, what things actually cost and who actually paid for them, we're going to keep building beautiful, terrible monuments to ambition, and we're going to keep being surprised when they turn out to be haunted. If you've stayed to the end of this, if you followed this story through all its dark turns and uncomfortable revelations, then you already know that the easy version of history isn't the true one. The question is whether knowing the true version changes anything. Whether it makes you see buildings differently, see wealth differently, see the stories we tell about success differently. These are the questions worth sitting with. These are the conversations worth having. And if this story made you think, made you pause, made you reconsider something you thought you understood, then that pause is worth marking. Share it. Talk about it. Let it complicate the easy narrative. That's how these stories survive, and why they matter. Frank Woolworth wanted immortality. He got it. But not in the way he imagined. His building stands, but what it immortalizes isn't his triumph, it's his tragedy, and the tragedy of everyone whose labor and sacrifice and pain were folded into the limestone and steel and forgotten. That's the real legacy. That's what the Woolworth Building actually means. Not a cathedral of commerce. A monument to cost.